All right, great. Thanks for everybody for joining us today. My name is Jacob Gessling, and I'm one of the organizers of ASLE's Humanities on the Brink, along with Jordan Kinder and Bart Welling. I'm coming to you from Memphis, Tennessee as a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Literature and Languages at Christian Brothers University. I want to begin today by recognizing and acknowledging that I'm on the historic homeland of the Chickasaw Nation. Of course, this region was a long established territory for many indigenous peoples prior to their forced removal. This territorial acknowledgement is only a gesture, but it represents the beginning of a commitment to justice and reconciliation in the United States. So I want to thank Stephanie and Jennifer for agreeing to participate in this plenary conversation, and to those of you, and thank those of you who are joining us on the call or watching us on YouTube. I also want to thank the scholar activists who responded to our call for reflections on emergency in the humanities, including Dominic Boyer, Saskia Cornice, Ashley Dawson, Vishnupriya Ghosh, Aubrey Strike-Krug, and Sarah Jacket-Ray. If you all haven't had a chance to watch the gallery of video responses that Stephanie and Jennifer will be in dialogue with, we asked a handful of scholars to reflect on the state of the environmental humanities in relation to the overlapping ecological, social, and political emergencies in the present. And so basically we asked people to respond to the question, what is the relationship between your work and emergency or crisis, whether ecological, social, and or political? And how has the overlapping compounding aspect of emergencies in the present led you to rethink your work? So those videos are available to watch at any time on the off the conference webpage. So now to say a little bit about how we'll proceed today. Stephanie and Jennifer will take about 10 minutes each for their opening remarks, after which point they'll spend some time responding to each other. About midway through, we hope to open up the conversation here to the audience on Google Meet. And then if you're on YouTube, you can submit questions by typing it into the chat feature there, and Jordan will relay those questions. The protocol for asking a question is that you post it in the chat, which you can access by clicking the text bubble icon on the top right. Write that you'd like to ask a question and maybe even give a brief description of that question or its subject. I'll call upon you, ask that you unmute yourself, and then introduce yourself before asking your question, and then mute yourself after your question. And so as with most virtual meetings, hopefully you'll follow the etiquette of muting yourself when you're not speaking, and that will hopefully make allow the event to proceed smoothly. All right, so first I'll introduce our speakers. First, we're going to hear from Jennifer Wenzel. Jennifer is a scholar of post-colonial studies and environmental and energy humanities at Columbia University, where she is jointly appointed in the Department of English and Comparative Literature and the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies. Her new book, The Disposition of Nature, Environmental Crisis and World Literature, has just been published by Fordham University Press. With Imre Zeman and Patricia Yeager, she co-edited Fueling Culture, 101 Words for Energy and Environment. Her first book, Bulletproof, Afterlives of Anti-Colonial Prophecy in South Africa and Beyond, was awarded honorable mention for the Perkins Prize by the International Society for the Study of Narrative. Her current research examines the fossil-fueled imagination in literature, visual culture, and public life. Then after Jennifer, we'll hear from Stephanie LeMenager. Stephanie's work on climate change in the humanities has been featured in the New York Times, Climate Wire, Science Friday, NPR, the CBC, and other public venues. She is a Barbara and Carlisle Moore Professor of English and Professor of Environmental Studies at the University of Oregon, where she directs the Center for Environmental Futures with Professor Marcia Weisiger. Her publications include the books Living Oil, Petroleum Culture in the American Century, and Manifest in Other Destinies. So now is the point where we would usually, if we were here in person, be applauding or something like that. But since we can't do that, I'll just hand it over to Jennifer.
All right, have I unmuted myself? Yes, I have. Wonderful. So I'd like to give thanks to Jacob, Bart, and Jordan for organizing this urgently timely conference. I'm honored to take part in it, and I'm thrilled to have the chance to think in real time with Stephanie LeMenager. I don't think I've stopped thinking with her work since I first read it years ago. And I'm excited about this opportunity to reflect on why we do the work we do, particularly in a moment like this one. And I want to come at this question indirectly with a vignette from my teaching this past semester. The first novel on my syllabus after spring break in mid-March was Nadine Gordimer's July's People, published in 1981, which imagines a near-future revolutionary upheaval in apartheid South Africa. Gordimer's future projection of racial apocalypse is focalized through a liberal suburban white woman who makes a sudden decision to flee Johannesburg with her family and hide out in the village of her domestic servant. It's a difficult novel to teach in ordinary times, partly because of Gortimer's merciless use of free indirect discourse to stage through her protagonist, Maureen, the inadequacies of white liberalism. And I've found that without careful attention to formal questions of rhetoric and narration, students often mistake the protagonist's thoughts and desires for Gortimer's own. This was the novel my students read over what passed for spring break this year, after they were all suddenly expelled from campus. And honestly, at first, I couldn't bear to contemplate teaching this book, as I faced my own wrenching decision about whether to stay in Manhattan or run to Florida. A dilemma not at all like Maureen's in July's People, and yet the resonances were there. That's what my students had found too when we reconvened on Zoom, that this narrative of displacement and defamiliarization and disorientation spoke to their experience and their present unexpected circumstance in ways that surprised them, troubled them, captured their attention and curiosity. And I should also say that some of them read an online edition through the National Emergency Library of the Internet Archive, and that gave me a chance to talk about the post-World War II Armed Services edition and how they had given a boost to the paperback as a medium. I want to read here one of the passages from July's People that made me want to teach this book in that moment, a passage that I often think of and reach for in thinking about how to think about uncertain futures. In various and difficult circumstances, certain objects and individuals are going to turn out to be vital. The wager of survival cannot, by its nature, reveal which in advance of events. How was one to know? The circumstances are incalculable in the manner in which they come about, even if apocalyptically or politically foreseen. And the identity of the vital individuals and objects is hidden by their humble or frivolous role in an habitual set of circumstances. These sentences are so characteristic of Gortimer's difficult, dense, and distant narratorial style in this novel, and that stylistic restraint is crucial to the novel's depiction of the Gramscian interregnum, the time between the dying certainties of apartheid rule and whatever unknowable conditions are coming next. I work with my students in teasing out these broad historical implications of the novel in the context of apartheid South Africa. But I also asked them to think about what objects and individuals had turned out to be vital in their own recent flight from campus. For me, I told them it was a pair of overpriced, oversized ballet flats that I never wore in the old world, but that turned out to be vital because I could easily take them on and off without using my hands. I could even wear socks with them in March. And there are 4 things that I want to draw from this vignette that speak to what I see as commitments, contradictions, and predicaments that I've faced in doing environmental emergency humanities work. First, the importance of form, the power of literary mediation. July's People is a difficult novel to read and teach. It's risky and charged, even in normal times, quote unquote. But if students can grasp what Gortimer is doing in the novel with focalization, point of view, caustic irony as a solvent of ideology, I cannot not believe that they're better equipped as humans to live with other creatures in the world. Second, the complex power of analogy as opposed to identity, not sameness, but similarity. The unpredictable ways that novels grab our attention through unlikely sparks of recognition and improbable similarity. My class worked through an incredibly productive tension and ambivalence in relation to Maureen. Obviously, none of us was a middle-class white woman amidst the collapse of the apartheid order, but those analogical moments of recognition of some aspects of the experience of flight and sudden change perhaps hailed us into a better understanding of the novel than I've ever achieved in class before. In other words, grappling in sharp and specific terms with what students sometimes call relatability, but also its limits in making sense of a literary text. More broadly, to think about analogy itself as an enabling tool, an aid to thinking in nonlinear ways. This does not need to be identical to that in order for me to think with it, learn from it, be troubled by it. And I think analogy is a distant cousin of another aspect of the literary that's vital for me, the multivalent power of the as if, the counterfactual, which I hope we can talk about more today. The third thing I draw from this vignette is how my work on anti-colonial liberation movements in Africa, as well as the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, has served as an unexpected source of analogy and insight for my environmental humanities work. And I'm not just talking about the histories that underwrite environmental injustice, the planetary distribution of environmental benefits and burdens, but also by way of analogy about conceptual tools for thinking about commitment, temporality, and contingency. How long can one live in a state of cultural revolution is a question that I borrow from David Atwell. Reckoning with radical change as necessary and life-giving, but also confusing and exhausting, a question of duration and stamina amidst upheaval and unsettlement along the lines of what Sarah Jacket Ray described in her brief video. How to give of oneself is a question that I borrowed from Nadine Gordimer. For her, a question of commitment to the struggle. For me, a question of knowing what kinds of intelligence I can offer to the future. And my broader work on afterlives and anti-imperialist nostalgia prompts me to think about the affective power of unrealized dreams. In the context of decolonization movements, the unrealized dream of liberation, hope and disappointment, failure and unfailure, and more broadly, in the context of the Anthropocene, the falsification of promises of petromodernity, how unfulfilled expectations for the future can both inspire and constrain movements for change in the present. And the last thing I'll draw from my vignette about teaching July's people is the complex temporality of the passage I read and its relation to an ethics of anticipation and retrospection. What is going to turn out to be vital? The indispensable that lurks unpredictably within the everyday, the unknowability in advance of what radical change will feel like, and the humble objects that you will turn to, even when you live in certainty that change will come, must come. As Bhushnapriya Ghosh said in her video, thinking not just about emergency, but emergence, and I would say the way that there's a war between them, that a political state of emergency is directed in part against suppressing the emergence, and specifically the emergence and the sense of evolution of the unpredictable, of what cannot be predicted in relationship to prior conditions. So for me, one question about this strange temporality is how to be alert and alive to what's emerging despite a state of emergency, what couldn't have been predicted, resisting teleological narratives whose end is always already inscribed in the beginning. If that aliveness is an orientation toward futurity, I'm also interested in complex relations between past and present, how to reckon with debris, aftermaths, material hauntings. And I'm thinking about Anne-Laura Stoller's idea of imperial debris and ruination as a verb, the long aftermaths of decline, along the lines of Nixon's slow violence. In terms of energy transition, this means reckoning not only with the industry's stranded assets, I guess that's actually their problem, but also what Stephanie describes in her new work as stranded emotions in a new condition. Ashley Dawson spoke in his video about the terminal decline of fracking, which we can only welcome. But I think we also have to think about how even this decline brings new problems. Methane leaks from abandoned wells and this kind of state of abandonment as part of transition that we may not have reckoned with. Kim Tallbear spoke about unexpected flourishing in ruins, which brings to mind for me the idea of ruinate. Sorry, I don't have it written down. It's R-U-I-N-A-T-E, ruinate. If you look in the OED, you'll find that ruinate is a Jamaican term for secondary growth over previously cultivated land, so-called. But I want you to think about the history that is covered over in that topographical description. Ruinate is what becomes of abandoned plantations, quite specifically. So what comes in or after or amidst ruination is, among other things, regrowth and life. And I think I'll leave it there and look forward to the conversation.
Okay, so thank you so much, Jennifer. I'm always amazed by the precision of your insights. I feel as if you help me to understand my own thought in a way that I'm not able to do on my own. And I do want to sort of preface my brief reading with the statement that this is a very large conversation. one of the reasons that we wanted to bring in a video gallery was to think with other people in a kind of official format, I guess, but obviously the conversation needs to keep spiraling. I'm going to read a brief excerpt from my current book, which is the excerpt is called Welcome to the Ficta Scene. The book is about the unsettling of Euro-America, and it's under contract with Columbia University Press at the moment. I do want to acknowledge in an insufficient gesture that I am coming to you from unceded territory of the Kalapuya peoples in what is now Eugene, known as Eugene, Oregon. So let me begin with Welcome to the Ficta Scene. Welcome to the Ficta Scene, where the natural world is becoming so ecologically shattered that it no longer can function as a normalizing frame for white power and white privilege, or for the more unifying ideas that have sustained power globally, like modernity. Mainstream media rarely makes note of the ecological component of what is otherwise understood as our current malaise in the United States, even as the effects of a broken climate precipitate into political and psychological instability at every scale of human experience. And I just want to add that COVID itself is rarely discussed as an ecological phenomenon. There are wonderful writers and thinkers like Sonia Shah who are asking us repeatedly to do that thinking, but it isn't what typically appears. Fiction remains a rare site, I think, of cultural experimentation where some humans might live openly with and feel the planet's rejection of modernity as an economic and psychic structure. And I say some, primarily those of us, and I identify myself as one, who've been hailed into petro-modernity, like it or not. For me, the timescape of modernity persists uncomfortably with reminders of ecological shock. Consider the following anecdote as a farewell to wonderment, where wonder, as in pleasurable astonishment in the new, is understood as a foundational emotion of settler cultures. And this following vignette is a bit like my experiment with the new nature writing, so to speak. The eggs of common murres, the most ubiquitous and successful seabirds in North America, are conical. Their unique shape has been evolutionarily designed to keep them from rolling off the sea cliffs where the murres nest. Each female murre lays eggs with a specific pattern of dark, painterly spatters so that murre parents can identify their eggs at a distance in a crowded field of bluish speckled eggs, great numbers of them crammed in pockets of cliffs. There's nothing common about the expressionist phenotypal signature of the female murre. Even those humans like myself who were not raised to consider the powerful personhood of other animals make note of it. Add to this the equally remarkable fact that murres can dive up to 650 feet to catch schooling fish, that they fly up to 60 miles per hour. If you go to a coastal park in the places now known as the US or Canada, you may be hailed into the wonder of common murres by educational signage or by the murres themselves. The murres hailed me when I first visited the US Northwest in 1979 as a child from the flat inland prairies of Illinois. Murres' eggs are traditional food for indigenous communities along the Arctic coasts. For thousands of years, tribal nations on the coast of Alaska and the islands of the Bering Sea have harvested murres' eggs to mark the arrival of spring. When murre colonies fail to produce eggs or produce a radically diminished number of them, the loss of calories is devastating for Arctic communities where a gallon of milk might cost $8 or $9 or sometimes $20. It's a big food security issue, says Brandon Amashuk, the assistant director for Kawarak Inc., an association of Inuit communities in the Bering Strait region. We're right at the forefront of climate change. It's happening faster here than any place else. From the summer of 2015 through spring 2016, about 62,000 emaciated, dead, or dying murres washed onto the beaches along the west coast of North America, from Southern California to the Aleutian Islands. Researchers estimate that altogether 530,000 to 1.2 million of these birds died, based on the fraction of the murre population that can be found on monitored beaches only. These events co-occurred with the most powerful marine heat wave on record, a mass of warm ocean water from California to Alaska that persisted from 2014 through 2016 and is known popularly as the Blob. Now, like many children of mid-20th century modernity who hadn't seen the ocean, I met the Pacific in 1979 as a brilliant explosion of life. Add to the natural abundance of the Pacific coast that at the end of the 1970s, that at the age of 10, I already knew that I was queer. My family's long anticipated West Coast vacation began in San Francisco. Here with thunderclap force was home, it seemed, life abundant and without shame. My conservative parents unwittingly grabbed a table in Ghirardelli Square with two lesbians, Olive and Ruth, whose names still light me up, and whom I remembered and recognized at the time as exile kin. At 50, as a professor in Oregon, I can see that I have lived a version of the American dream afforded by the wicked systems, in fact, that are killing so many. It's easy to see this trajectory as merely a naive, blindly privileged one of homo liberalism. It's also the case that many of us, white, cis queers like myself, had come up through hatred and trauma, battering, rape, HIV, rejection by our birth families, to name a few things that some of us have lived. For some of us, indeed, life getting better in the liberal terms of stability and security seemed a miracle or a gift. As I came to understand, white capital has underwritten our gradual, if incomplete, acceptance and normalization through state-sanctioned institutions like marriage for those of us who wish to accept these terms. Seabirds and the planktonic food web that supports their thriving have been less fortunate, as have countless other more than human beings and a majority of the planet's humans. Let's revisit the ecosystems of the US Pacific Coast in 2020. The massive recent extinction event of the common mers, the gruesome liquefaction of Pacific sea stars to a wasting disease also caused by ocean warming, the flooding and burial of coastal wetlands by frequent major storms. In short, the world that I fell in love with, a coastal world of the 20th century that seemed to love me once more than I could love myself, that world is dying. This not only indicates that that world is not what it was, or what I thought that it was, but it also indicates that I am not what I thought I was. The cracks in the timescape of modernity opened why the climate crisis affect personal memory and self-narration, as well as normative categories like history, modernity, and the present. And I think many of the talks that we've actually heard during this conference, probably most profoundly the work of Professor Tallbear, have talked about how settler time is being denaturalized in this moment. And I do think that that is one way in which emergency is sort of functioning to bury emergence. I mean, if we talk about this as emergency and not as a sharpening of the already present, to quote Professor Tallbear and ultimately Junot Diaz, I think we do miss the kind of possibility that also is alive in this moment. And yet, how can anyone equivocate about the deaths? So many deaths. And deaths that again reflect histories of colonialism and capitalism and the intertwinement of those systems against peoples of color, indigenous peoples. So I'm very happy to transition from my own work to a larger discussion with Professor Wenzel and with all of you. And I wanted to mention again that I really value the work of those who appeared in the video gallery. I myself drew a couple of different themes out of those presentations, themes of unlearning, stamina, where to direct the limited energy that we have in this moment, repair, and theory in the world, practitioner theory. I think all of these themes are really important. They certainly press upon the collective projects that I'm engaged in right now, collective pedagogical projects. And I think each person who contributed to the gallery, Dominic Boyer, Saskia Korn, Sarah Jaquette Ray, Vishnupriya Ghosh, Aubrey Streit Krug, each one of these people is exemplifying, I think, a mode of transitional pedagogy and scholarship, which is worth focusing upon. When Professor Wenzel and I talked about our conversation, when Jennifer and I talked about our conversation, we pulled out three potential discussion points that we might touch on. One, how are emergencies contingencies, and why does contingency matter? Two, why read or write about fictions in the time of COVID, climate change, and a kind of sharpening American fascism? And three, is grief a form of activism? And how do we outsource in this moment our careers, if not our lives? So I wanted to hand the discussion back to Jennifer, since I've spoken a lot.
Thanks to you both. I was just going to add real quick. So if people would like to maybe start adding their questions into the chat, we can just kind of get a queue going while Jennifer and Stephanie talk a bit, and then we'll be ready when we turn to those. So sorry for interrupting you, Jennifer.
No worries. I wanted to ask Stephanie a question that occurred to me all over again as I was listening to you read from your wonderful introduction, and that is about the question of wonder, because I think that what part of what you're doing there is grieving your prior sense of wonder, which I would describe under the category of unlearning, right? And what I want to ask is there a possibility of something like wonder, maybe an analogous emotion to wonder outside of settler culture? So can they be untangled, or what replaces wonder besides grief, in addition to grief? And I'm thinking very specifically about a student I had who was majoring in biology, and I taught in a study abroad program on post-colonial London in London. And as we were learning about the history of imperial botanical gardens, she was having a crisis in terms of her interests, and it was thinking about not becoming a biologist. And it's a kind of sweet and naive example of confronting the contamination of one's own discipline. And I think we in literary studies know this contamination from people like Gauri Viswanathan in terms of the origins of literary studies in British imperialism in India. And so what I'm wondering is whether curiosity is always complicity, and whether, and I ask this partly out of a sense of, as teachers, we cannot disavow curiosity, right? I mean, we're in a lot of trouble in the classroom if our students are afraid to be curious, right? So I would just love to hear you talk a little bit about, like, amidst this grief for your own prior sense of what the world was and what you were. I am not what I thought I was, is something that you said that I think is so powerful. Like, how do we think about our own desire to know, and our students, our desire for our students to know, and their desire to know, with this awareness of contamination and complicity?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the question for me of the emergency always comes back to teaching.
Yeah.
Because that's what I do, and that's how I keep myself afloat. And I think the responsibility to create a classroom where the passion of wonder as intellectual discovery is present, that's a responsibility that I still claim, and I have to answer to. And I think, first of all, I just want to say, I think wonder is related to this kind of intellectual passion, a kind of passion of problem solving or of learning. And so how do you feel wonder in a context of unlearning, if you are part of a settler culture, if you're becoming more and more aware of your white privilege and the way that has damaged the world, really, or the many worlds, I should say, that we inhabit. I think there is, a possibility in grief for love, a greater love of worlds, and in a way, I think grief performs a kind of decentering of itself. I don't agree with Freud that it becomes a sort of narcissism. I mean, I see Katrina Sandy Lenz is on our feed here. I think about the way she's written about eco-melancholy and queer melancholy and modes of melancholic attachment that are a form of witnessing and affording dignity to those who haven't been dignified or seen. And I would just say, from my own perspective, as somebody who has both benefited tremendously from wicked systems and also always been a little bit outside of them as a queer person who has had some actual trauma around that, I think the discovery of my discenteredness, of my need to become smaller, to kind of go to Dominic Boyer's point about hyposubjectivity, there's something very, very beautiful about that. But the real question for me within an institutional structure that has rewarded a kind of multicultural framework of inclusion that welcomed me is, how do we perform that letting go and becoming smaller institutionally and still occupying the role of teachers? And I think that's a hard one for me. I think the intellectual journey and the wonderment that could be segueing into grief, which itself becomes a form of more profound love, I think that journey feels very valuable still. But how to perform a more legitimate collaborative pedagogy, I turn to Sarah Jaquette Ray, who I think does wonderful work on kind of rethinking pedagogy in a time of mourning. These are questions that have to be fought out at the institutional level and have to be expressed through structural change in how we reward work, and value work. And I think that's really a tough battle that's going to be a long one. Can I just would you mind if I turn that question back on you? Because I feel like you asked it so beautifully that you may actually have answers more profound than my own. So
I'll turn the question back on myself, is it?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I may have given what I have as the answer, just in terms of thinking about inhabiting contaminated disciplines and complicit institutions. I think back partly to advice that I was given by my dissertation director, Barbara Harlow. I think not so much when I was a graduate student, but afterwards, when I began to have different roles within institutions. And we can think about the language that she used to describe this and the undercurrent of it. But what she said particularly about the university, is that it's important to occupy the institutional space that you have, and that you do not give up any space, right? And so we can think about the ways, and I think that your footnote or the second part of that for you is like, okay, how can you make sure that we hold on to the space, but also share the space, right? So the you do not give up any space need not be a singular you, and must not be a singular you. It must be a plural you. And so we can think about the violence and the. I'm glad I was going to use the word wicked systems as well, of those institutions. But I think I'm still within the position of wanting to occupy and share the space that I have. I think this is less an answer than an acknowledgement that I don't have the answers, and I'm thinking about something that I think is also going to be in your new book project, but it's an essay that people can see now, the Notes for a Civics of the Sixth Extinction, where you talk so movingly, I think, about what it means to be parents who are basically Holocene people, or had thought of themselves as Holocene people, and confronting an inadequacy about how to raise humans for the Anthropocene, not knowing how to teach our children to be human. And I don't have children, but I do have graduate students, and I think this goes to that institutional question that you're talking about. And I wish that I had more concrete answers than I do, but I do feel, even as I want to hold on to that complicit institution of the university, I do feel a certain incapacity in suddenly not knowing how to transmit my knowledge to that next generation of students, right? So instead of not knowing how to teach my children to be humans, not knowing how to teach my graduate students how to be professional humanists, right? And I really don't have anything interesting to say that hasn't already been said about seasonality and solastalgia. Like, yes, I have it, you know, but I have also lost a sense of the seasonality of the job market, right? And so I think that it's this particular crisis has kind of, for me, been not only a species jump, but also a kind of phase shift, in which, you know, as Kim Thalberg said, that sharpening of the already present becomes just so palpable. Maybe I'll just say one more thing, since I was talking about the university, and that is about the liberal arts. I used to say, and this may be the last time I say it in public, actually, because it's one of the things that I feel like I've kind of, I don't know it works anymore, but I used to, I'll say it in the past tense, right? That I used to say that I wanted liberalism back so I could be critical of it, you know? And I don't know, maybe it's just not coming back. And that probably that's fine, right? But the liberal arts as, you know, this idea of multidisciplinary learning as preparation for citizenship, I think, like, I can describe that loss in very personal terms as something that my parents instilled in me, right? And so that's what I did. Went to a liberal arts college, you know, became an English professor. That's why I teach, partly, or it's why I have been teaching. And I found myself explaining in the past year to my parents the rationale for the liberal arts as if they had never heard it before, right? So thoroughly have they been interpolated into a right-wing anti-intellectualism. And so that for me was just like a moment of profound grief, like not exactly like not being who I thought I was, but not understanding how I came to be, partly from parents who are so different than what I thought they were. Yeah, I should probably lob a question back at you. But is there something in your nodding that?
Well, I was thinking about how one of the gifts of my own education was actually foregrounding contingency.
Yeah.
You know, and I think if you study histories and literatures, which I did, you know, you think about contingency, the idea of the absence of necessity, the fact of being so without having to be so. I kind of feel like that question of contingency is at the heart of all the work that I've done, you know, that Manifest on Their Destinies was about what would happen if that particular racist nationalist ideology had not actually taken hold.
Yeah.
What were the other possibilities, the contingencies that were all sort of in play at that time in the 19th century up to the 20th? And I think similarly with living oil, it's like, well, why are some of us living oil or wanting to be living oil, wanting to get sort of jump into petrodmodernity or to continue to bask in its various sort of sensory and sensory pleasures and privileges, and yet there's always been these alternatives lurking around the corner. So to me, the liberal arts education that I had anyway, it opened cracks in hegemonies.
Yeah.
And Jennifer and I were talking yesterday about how, you know, one could think about hegemony as where desire affects to power. And, you know, how do you unlock that? How do you get people to stop dreaming about the state, to kind of, again, try to paraphrase Professor Thalberg, and I'm probably not doing it justice, but I think there are ways in which the kind of imaginative and sensory expression that has happened over many years, even within the cultures that haven't benefited and invented these wicked systems, show potential ways out, offer interstices, if you will, among hegemonies and hegemonic processes. So I do feel like there's a way in which I welcome transition because of my liberal arts education. And I think as a teacher, I really want to hold on to the fact that I believe we are potentially in a profound moment of transition. Actually, Dawson in his video gallery talk mention how, there's a potential moment of transition towards an energy commons. And it's a very exciting idea. I like Dawson's work because it allies itself with social movement building. And it's very accessible in terms of the writing. But he says, here we have this moment, but then already states are pulling from the public coffers to support big energy. So there are ways in which the structures of power seem entirely inaccessible, I think, to myself and to many people. But there also are ways in which cultural expression can move the world in ways that politics does not, or at least initially does not. And so how do we kind of tap into that? And I also just want to sort of step back and say, I think one incredibly profound intervention into Euro-Western environmentalism is just the absolute fact of colonization and the profound power of indigenous resurgence throughout the world and also in the academy. So, I mean, I think, I can't occupy that position. I don't want to try to occupy that position in the way that my people have occupied indigenous territory. But I do feel like, I really have become so much more aware of the provincialism of my own history, worldviews, liberalism or post-liberalism, and the fact that to get through a transition, to go somewhere in the present that is not nostalgia, indigenous thought, I think is must be absolutely recognized by all of us, and also will probably play and has been playing a profound role in terms of leadership. So, I mean, there's a lot to be celebrating in terms of the possibility of transition, and yet the horror of recapitulating the wicked systems with more and more progressive violence is also on us. And I hope that the liberal arts can help us to at least hold the transition.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much, and I'm not sure how to get into it, but I'll embrace the nonlinear, I guess. I think what you say about contingency and the idea that that things could have been otherwise. The other side of that, in the direction of precarity, is that I think part of what has been such a shock about this pandemic is how things are actually otherwise than we thought, or how quickly they can be otherwise than we thought in terms of certain kinds of illusions of security. But I also think that maybe that contingency is wrapped up in what you were describing with Katrina Sandilands' idea of critical melancholy, or what I've tried to work through in terms of a kind of critical anti-imperialist nostalgia, in terms of unrealized possibilities. So not holding on to the dream of the state, but unrealized possibilities that still can be resources for thinking. I realized at a certain point when my new book came out that the last paragraph of it is basically a rewriting of my first book, right? In the sense that the books are about totally different things, but they're both about the kind of both the dangers and the perils, and also the kind of potential of of alternative possibility, right? I think that must be the kind of driving force of my work, and I think that you're absolutely right about how to think about that intersubjectively, how to in the classroom, how to think about it structurally in the university, and I think what's really moving to me, listening to the introduction from your new work, is braiding together. I think the frictions, but also the connections between a kind of personal sense of loss, guilt, love, and kind of informed resolve with the kind of fraying and falsification of national narratives that you may not have ever bought into in the first place. When we were talking yesterday about grief, one of the things that I think that I grieve, and this is abstract and maybe too general, but one of the things I think I grieve is a certain kind of historical innocence, and I want to be really precise about what I'm saying here. I think it's along the lines of what Gayatri Spivak has called sanctioned ignorance, right? What the powerful get away with not knowing. And so it's not the loss of innocence. It's not that I want to be innocent, but the structural necessity in the first place, right, of that innocence, the ways in which the status quo demands blindness to the suffering that subsidizes my existence, right? So that's the thing that I grieve, and I like your idea of thinking about that kind of dynamic as becoming smaller, but also maybe becoming wider in terms of a spiraling conversation, right? And becoming wider in terms of connecting one's work with others, right? Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think at some point I'd love to return to the really beautiful afterword to your book, The Disturbance of Nature, and the concepts of beneficent versus malignant fictions, which I think you just highlighted in the first part of your gloss here.
Yeah.
I did want to just sort of to bring us back to the conversation that we invited with our gallery participants too, to talk a little bit about that that way in which getting wider, so to speak, can be represented in various forms of para-academic work. I think about Saskia Korn's really beautiful presentation for the gallery, where she talks about working with billions of co-workers in the soils to try to repair the soils in the kind of small scale farming that she's involved with on the Duke campus farm. I also think about what she says here about farmers, and I'm gonna read this. She says, farmers are always navigating radical contingencies. And I think that takes me back to something that Professor Tallbear said as well in her talk, which is like, how does theory come in practice? How is theory practice? How can we sort of imagine classroom spaces within the university that are practice-based, where we derive theoretical insight from the practice itself, and kind of reframing what is meant by expertise as well, as I think many of us are interested in. I want to also just give a shout out to Aubrey Streit-Krug and the work she's doing at the Lands Institute in Salinas, Kansas, which seems similarly to be very much about moving into relationship building with plants as potential collaborative agents. So there's a lot of ways that we can think about para-academia, but of course, how is it funded? We know from what Saskia Korn's told us about the Duke Campus Farm that might be one of the first places that loses funding, and funding will continue to support monographs by professors like myself. You know, I think that's a really interesting institutional problem to sort of keep hammering away at. We right now at my center are doing a project on essential work, and we're trying to bring in professors of the practice who are working in nonprofits, in one case in the union that represents farm workers here in the Pacific Northwest, and just trying to really sort of recalibrate funding streams as well as attention to people who are essentially professors of the practice, helping the world to just function in this moment of an extreme sharpening of what has always been present.
And I think it's a commonality between your work and mine, but certainly not unique to it. I think about thinking about, you mentioned malignant and beneficent fictions, right? And I think that the environmental humanities is poised to think about these questions of fictionality, as you say, and the imagination as things that are deeply literary and show up in literature, but are by no means not restricted to the literary text. And I think that's one of the ways of thinking about a kind of para-academic or para-humanities practice, is to think about what we know about the imagination and the way that fiction making works, and how that can speak to people who don't really care about literature. And not everybody has to care about literature, I think, in order to make interventions on the ways that the imagination can wreak havoc in the world, but also can be a source of repair. And I think it's those habits of mind that allow me to appreciate so much not only the work that Ashley Strike-Krug is doing, that she's describing in that video, but also the kind of, for me, the kind of sheer delight of the contingent, and that is the photobombing by the plant. It's like, hey, I'm here helping you. Right? I mean, you couldn't plan, maybe she did, I don't know. But it seems like you couldn't plan for that kind of interaction of the wind and the plant and the camera and the person. Sorry, I'm just imagining a t-shirt, to kind of to demonstrate in another way, in addition to her words, the point that she's making. I'm wondering whether we should, I don't know if you have a response, or maybe we should.
No, I think we should probably transition to broader questions.
Okay, yeah, we have several questions kind of queued up here that we can go through. So Chelsea, Ray, do you want to start off by reading to speak a little bit about your question? And you just unmute yourself and then start speaking. Okay, can you hear me? Yes. Great. Sorry about my camera. It's acting funky. This is a really eloquent talk. Thank you so much. You addressed contingency and the speculation of how things could have been otherwise, and then you sort of dovetailed this into the unrealized possibilities. And I think about this form of thinking. I've always been fascinated with contingency, and I rarely hear it mentioned, but to me, I'm wondering how we could speculate around contingent thinking and contingency awareness and marry that to ecological thinking and awareness. And even more so in centering the more than human world primarily and watching how they deal with contingency, and then taking something that then we can teach through to our species with that. So marrying the as maybe a technology, a counter technology of contingency awareness with emergent thinking, with ecologies around us, and the more than human teachers among us. So that's kind of my thought. Thanks for any speculations around that.
I love that. I mean, I feel that was just a beautiful addition to this conversation, and one that I would like to take up in my own thinking and my own work. I also I think it's kind of brilliant to, in a way, call attention to the fact that one of the problems of humanism as it's been produced through Euro-Western histories and culture is that in a way it has unfurled against a horizon of rationality as opposed to contingency. And I think there have been various movements within Euro-Western thought, like the new materialisms, etc., which have pushed far, far, far away from those models and have pushed us back into the radical contingencies of biologies as they interact and unfurl. This moment of COVID is a great time to read about the biological, even though, as Vishnu Priya Ghosh reminds us in her brilliant talk, that viruses are mediated in certain ways that capture certain aspects and completely render invisible other aspects of their mode of function. But I think, again, I return to Sonia Shah's work on pandemic. There's so much to be learned about the more than human aspects of pandemic, and then how the very limited attention to contingency, really, on the part of various so-called modern human cultures has opened the door to devastation on the part of viruses. So I love that, and I think that's a really great set of thoughts to think with in this moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel like it can bridge us towards places where, how you said, politics cannot, as movements. So let's explore it.
I'm not sure I have much to add to the wonderful question and Stephanie's rich response, but just to kind of offer crude translations. I mean, it seems to me if ecological thinking can be translated to relationality and contingency is a lack of necessity or unpredictability. I think Stephanie's absolutely right about the problem with rationality and even probability or improbability. And so yeah, I really appreciate the thinking relationality and everything is connected as only meaning that we know both more and so much less about what will happen. Yeah, it's a lovely question. Thank you.
Great. So next we have Vishnu Priya, which if I can read your question, but if you would like to talk through your question, Vishnu, I'll give you a second to jump in here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes. So I just wanted to ask a question that both of you brought up in your comments. Jennifer, you were talking about a trajectory that I've also followed from post-colonial liberation struggles to ecological. And I know Stephanie has talked about indigenous folks who've been living with emergency for a very long time, right? So this is not anything new. It's just that at one stage, it becomes everyone's emergency, right? And at that point, we go back and we think, oh my God, we're in the middle of a crisis, right? This crisis. So I'm actually wanting to go back to Anna Singh's question about disturbances are always there in the natural world, right? They're constantly happening. That's how ecological systems work. Which ones do we focus on? Which ones do we repair? Is it just because self-interest that now we're going to have to go back and look at viruses and zoonotic spillovers just because we're all in lockdown, you know? So you know what I mean? So this question of the anthropocentric that we want to put aside all the time keeps returning because we've recognized certain disturbances as emergencies. So the simple question is, which disturbances become emergencies?
I think maybe I should not leap in because I feel profoundly how inadequate this answer is. But you know, I think that you're absolutely right that we're all in emergency now, and I think you also know and feel that we're absolutely not in the same way. And you know, there's lots I could say about my own experience and how I grapple with that in really real terms. And so I feel like I don't have the ability or the standing to say which disturbances we focus on or repair, right? Partly because we're all in multiple emergencies at the same time, but we're not in the same emergencies necessarily, and we're not in them in the same way. So I recognize that as a cop-out, but also as a qualification to think about what Jacob and Bart and Jordan talked about as the overlapping and cascading emergencies of the present. And maybe Stephanie will have had time to think and offer a more adequate answer.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think my answer is adequate either, but I'll just say I think that some of this has to do with tempo.
Yeah.
You know, I think about Rob Nixon's slow violence, the whole question of slowly unfolding structural violence of various kinds, the tempo of that versus the tempo of suddenly mass graves being dug in New York City. You know, I mean, not suddenly, but you know, over the period of a month or so. So tempo is one issue that plays into which disturbances get paid attention to. Yeah. But to the question of the anthropocentric, I mean, I think that's a really important question for people who come out of eco-criticism to consider. And I go back to Ramachandra Guha, actually, and his critique of preservationism within the Euro-Western environmental movement, and how, you know, he sort of says essentially, here's two emergencies. He doesn't use the word emergency, but the hyper-consumerism of both the Euro-West, the global North, the elites within the global south, that's an emergency. We could also ally that with extractivism, as we now understand the sort of history and present tense of that set of violent actions. But also, here's another emergency: the militarism of these same nations who have seen themselves as sort of at the center of empire, or in the case of the United States, is simply somehow, the exceptional nation that all world cultures and nations look to as exemplary of modernity. So I think there are many long emergencies that, because of the tempo and also because of the positionality where the emergencies originate. I forget which theorist tells us that the originary moment is often pushed aside. I think, Jennifer, you write about this perhaps in various settler colonialist discourses. We always get, and then this happened, the second. But the originary violence, the genocides, et cetera, is not what the dreaming of the settler state focuses upon. So I think we have to think about positionality and tempo, and also go back to the very early critiques of environmentalism within the Euro-West and global North that immediately identified this problem as one that is not a problem of anthropocentrism versus ecocentrism. Because that's a false dichotomy that just distracts us, I think, from the work we in fact have to do now.
Yeah, and I think I could say class inequality, racial minoritization, and white supremacy are like obviously things that we have to work on. But that I'm going to say that, right? But I think I love the idea of tempo as a really sharp predicament of how to think of hunger and of food insecurity, really sharp food insecurity, and the threat of eviction, and so do I make contributions to get people fed now when I know that the food system that will feed them is, in terms of wide networks, is actually probably part of why we're in this pandemic to begin with. Or how to think about activism against evictions in terms of the broader, just incredibly violent churning of real estate development in places like New York and Seattle, that it was itself already a form of violence before this even began. And so how do you respond to those just unbelievable needs in the present, and in such a way that keeps an eye also on the long term, and without I suppose too much entrenching the wicked and violent systems that got us here to begin with, right? It's hard to say, I can't contribute to those things now because they're a source of they're part of a structure of violence, right? How do you do both at the same time when you're living these different tempos?
Thank you.
Great. So our next question, we have Ann D. Would you like to ask your question, Ann?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Sorry, my camera is not working. Was it deactivated by the by you, or anyway? So my question is, I'm actually Heidi. I'm doing this together with Anna, so we're two people sitting in front of the screen. So the question I want to ask, I want to go back to Deleuze and Guattari's concept of the rhizome, which I think is very helpful in talking about current issues. But I think that the rhizome should now be turned into, if I can say that, the mycelium. And I think instead of talking about arborescent structures, which the rhizome kind of belongs to, not really, but I think the rhizome, when you look at it from a biological perspective, is very, limited to a certain area and is not very intelligent and so on. But when you look at the mycelium, in connection, it's not really the roots of mushrooms, but it kind of, belongs to the mushroom kingdom, so to say. And I think with the mycelium, one can discuss so many things, and also, referring to Annette Fink's work and to Tim Ingold. Tim Ingold actually, started the discussion of maybe the mycelium would be a better concept than the rhizome. So I just wanted to throw out this question, if you would think it as an interesting, discussion point to focus on the mycelium. And I want to go to Jeff Diamantis' question, in regards to doing fieldwork. I think, growing mushroom in the classroom would be such an amazing tool to look into all kinds of things, in Annette Fink's work, and the intelligence of mushrooms and how you can transform the mushroom to the, our current culture, where you have, an unlimited connections and highly intelligent networks, and, how things spread really fast. So I think by using mushrooms in the classroom, you can just discuss so many things. You can also discuss, urban agriculture and disturbance, and what it means to have, systematic disruptions in a, in a forest, and how that impacts mushrooms, in like how Annette Fink describes, once you don't have disturbance anymore, you don't have the mushrooms anymore. So what does it do if we don't have disturbance? What does it do to humans if they don't have some tragedy in their life? That happens also, and it's actually quite tragic for the people who don't have any tragedies, as weird it sounds. So I think, I wanted to ask, what do you think about this mycelium concept? Because this is something I'm working on, and I think it's very, very powerful. Thank you so much.
I guess I would say great. It sounds like you have a kind of wonderful set of ideas there, both in terms of a metaphor or a form to think with, as you've suggested, and also, one of the ideas I really value in Stephanie's work is the idea of materializing and really making our thoughts and practices material. And so working with the mushroom in the classroom is to me a really wonderful way that I'm not really equipped to say much more about, but I think it could be a model for both kind of probing formal and metaphorical and conceptual questions, and also the real kind of question of mushroomness that students can get to know with their hands and their eyes and their noses.
Yeah, and it might be really, I also just want to comment on your eloquent statement. I think you give us a lot to think about, and thinking about fungal intelligence versus arboreal intelligence. I mean, I think about, you could read the overstory next to Anna Singh's wonderful The Mushroom at the End of the World, which is a brilliant critique of modernity as it's been understood and implemented. So, anyone who has not yet read that must read it. And I think that could be a really interesting combination for those who have not engaged those two books, to sort of think through the ways that metaphors derived from different forms of plant intelligence afford distinct modes of action as well as agency. So I think that's quite interesting. Thank you for that comment.
Can I just follow up?
Go ahead.
I just wanted to say it's really easy to buy those mushroom kits online, so the student could actually do that at home. So they could grow mushrooms, eat them, and then, you don't have to do it in classroom because it's a problem now. So they could just, have it at home. It's not that expensive. And then you can share that experience. So I think that would be a really cool way. And at the end, they have something to eat. So it's not really that expensive for them. And I did one of them, and, it's really easy. You just cut a few holes, put water in it, and they grow within a few days. So, yeah. And the other thing is, there's a film by Paul Stamets, who is an expert on mushrooms, and it's called Fantastic Fungi. I really recommend that film because it talks about fungi intelligence. Thank you.
So, thank you, Anne. Anne kind of hinted at the next question, which is coming from Jeff Diamante, who cannot read his question. So this is the voice of Jeff. I want to pick up on Stephanie's point about praxis in EH. The paradox of the upcoming year is we can't do a whole lot of field work with students, or at least we need to radically reimagine it. Perhaps this is a year to recalibrate our theoretical framework in order to unlearn crisis management and relearn decolonial forms of compassion and wonder. what would be week 1 of a graduate class on ecological theory after, during, as if COVID will amplify our habits of knowing climate change? So that's Jeff's question.
I think Jeff must have week 1 in mind.
I don't. I'm
come on.
I'm resisting with all of my might the compulsion to turn a graduate room into a space to talk about COVID. And maybe that's my problem, but I just think that there's something to like not doing that. And so I like Stephanie's point a lot about praxis and inhabiting a kind of space of praxis within the environmental humanities. And my answer to that sort of call usually is to get outside and to find sort of, collaborative models within the cities I teach in order to get students to actually get their hands dirty. But I can't do that this year. So I'm just thinking like maybe this is a year to really sharpen our theoretical tools. And if you think that's true as well, like what do you want to go back to this year? What do you think graduate students who are really nervous about all kinds of things, precarity, hygiene, the economy, and so on, what do they need to think with for life after, during, et cetera, COVID? That's my question.
Yeah.
Right. It's funny because Jeff, you mentioned at the beginning that it's a bad time to be doing field work, and I agree with you absolutely. Some of you may know that I'm involved in a field-based project called To Speak of Common Places, where with groups of students we're going out all over Oregon and talking about the public lands with various stakeholders, from indigenous communities for whom this is traditional territory that is unceded and has been turned into the quote unquote public lands, to farmers, ranchers, people who do recreation in those spaces, environmentalists, et cetera. We're not going to be doing any of that. This project is on hold because we don't want to introduce, COVID into particularly the rural areas where the healthcare system is so is in such a profound state of precarity. So that said, I still think it might be useful to theorize and perhaps even enact in a small way what Sarah Jacquette Ray in her video gallery statement talked about as kind of the elaboration of mutual aid and regenerative economy. And I guess I don't know that I have the best examples of how to do that, and Jennifer might, having been in New York through this and having had some experience, but I know I've been doing just small distribution. The Center for Sustainability here created a mutual aid network online, and we've been distributing first PPE. Now we're distributing recycled laptop computers to various people who need either PPE protection and don't have easy access to it, and now people who want to be online with their children, for instance, participating in educational opportunities such as they are as we move into online education in K-12 here in Eugene through the fall, but who may not have easy access to laptop computers that they can take to a place where they get Wi-Fi access. So I think trying to find ways of doing mutual aid and kind of using the university as a space in which to do that, and also theorizing what we might mean by regenerative economy with students could be very helpful. I find it helpful for myself. I mean, I think we all are experiencing a kind of crisis of those of us involved in universities about what the university actually is in a moment like this.
Yeah.
Rather than an institution that simply takes students' tuition money with a sort of false promise of in-person education, which is in fact potentially destructive to everyone. What can we do? How can we participate in what Ashley Dawson has called disaster communism? Is there a way to kind of think through that and actually in small ways that don't affect the health of your students or others to begin to practice it? I don't have the syllabus for that. I think it's going to look different in every context, but I do feel like this is one thing that I'm teaching a graduate class on the commons in the spring, and I'm actually hoping to start to enact some of that kind of mutual aid networking.
Yeah, and I also don't have week 1 ready for you. I guess I just have some observations about premises that are at work here, and I absolutely agree. I think it was Sarah Jacquette Ray who mentioned mutual aid, as you said, Stephanie, and And that certainly has been an important development here in New York. And I guess I have to say two things about it. One is that it becomes important in the face of the abdication of the state, right? And I think nothing will do more to loosen those dreams of the state than just witnessing not failure, but abdication, and perhaps even sabotage by the state. And I think the reason that Stephanie went to mutual aid is that I think like never before, we are having to think of our students as whole persons, and losing the classroom as a site of gathering. And again, to borrow from Stephanie, shared attention, I think is a really wonderful idea that you have, means to meet them where they are, which is on your screen, but what is happening behind the screen, and how to think about where they're coming from as you think about where you want to take them. I think it was also Sarah Jacquet-Ray who talked about the intensification of the nearby, and so just in practical terms, like I see that that group fieldwork is not going to happen. And I think that by necessity, we can either like do the same thing but do it on Zoom, or we can think about like really, if we haven't been already in our teaching, taking seriously the flipped classroom and decentering, so that sending our students out individually to where they are and reporting back, I think requires a kind of shifting of frameworks and expectations, but might actually generate some different, it might generate insights that you couldn't have gotten if you were all traipsing around Amsterdam together, if that's where you were going to do it. But at the same time, I think more with my undergrads than my graduate students, I often use the fact that Columbia never washes the windows of its buildings to talk about the window as a form of mediation that frames the view that we have. And so I ask them to look at the dirty streaks on the window as evidence that a representation is not transparent, right? And that as we sit in a classroom together, kind of performing what Stephanie calls shared attention, that we can each kind of see what's outside the window, but each of us comes at it from a different angle. And I'm not sure that I figured out in my pedagogy, like how to use that kind of idea of what mediation is to think about my students, sitting wherever it is that they are individually. And so I suppose I'm just as I'm just as lost as you are, and Jeff, you're not lost, of course, but I am befuddled, and I also have to acknowledge like the really difficult pressures that universities are facing, and I'll just go ahead and say it, that it feels to me like Columbia in particular right now is pushing so hard to get students back in classrooms, and to on the one hand I understand why they're doing that, but it's a pressure I cannot not be suspicious of. So the kind of institutional context here is really tricky, I think, and wicked.
Great. I think we have a few comments that could be questions here in the chat.
Yeah.
So if anybody wants to chime in, otherwise we probably have time for about one more question. So if anybody would like to take that spot, feel free. All right, Stephanie and Jennifer, do you have any comments that you would like to address to each other as we wrap up?
I just want to thank Jennifer for her work and the care that you, Jennifer, exemplify in your scholarship. I think scholarship can feel like a sort of slow counter-violence, and sometimes, for my students anyway, it's hard to see why we should engage in it in a time like this, or frankly, a time like 100 years ago, or a time like 50 years ago, or a time, again, the emergency is long. Yeah. But I feel that the sort of more aware that we are of our own histories, of other historical configurations and modes of thought, the more likely it is that something like transition can actually occur. And I always get a kind of sharpening of my own insights and knowledge from you, Jennifer, and I just want to thank you for that. And I also want to thank all of the people who have planned this this online symposium. I know it's not easy to do these kinds of things, and I think you're doing a terrific job, so thank you for that.
Yeah, I will thank as well Stephanie, who I think is an indispensable guide to the American 20th century or the American century, and is going to be a guide to the reasons why the 21st century will not be the American century, and why that may be okay, is probably okay. And I've said it before in print, and I think it's a wonderful opportunity to say it again, that I think that the work that you have done, and I could have said this to Jeff, the work that you've done in Living Oil, I think can be a model, not just for students interested in petrocultures. I know I assume not everyone on this call is really interested in energy, but really a model for what literary and cultural criticism can be. And so it's been really a delight to think with you and to, I'm not sure if it's a rhizome or a fungus, but to kind of push our thinking broader in the world. And I guess I would also say, to the organizers that when you first approached me about doing this conference, I was in Paris this fall just before the strike. That was my first kind of upheaval of the past 12 months. And I was like, yeah, that sounds like a blast. And then when you wrote to me in March, it was quite literally all I could do to type a 1-sentence reply that said, yes, I'll still do that. But I'm sure that there are many people on this call and many people not on the call, but in the conference, for whom this was both a difficult provocation, but a necessary kind of community building exercise for thinking about what we do know and what we do know how to do, and also what we don't know and what we don't know how to do yet, and learning from each other how to do it together. So thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thanks to you both again, and thank you to everybody who joined us on this call. So this is the last formal live event of the conference. We have a social event, I believe Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern. And so feel free to join us, to anybody then. Otherwise, we'll have this archived up if anybody wants to go back and watch it, and I'll talk to you later. Thanks again.